Hello and welcome to my session. My name is Ralph Pantozzi, and I am a teacher at Kent Place School in Summit, New Jersey. I've been a mathematics teacher for 30 years, and I'm also affiliated with various organizations that are interested in mathematics education. I do work for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics, the Mathematical Association of America, as well as the National Museum of Mathematics. Following my presentation, I'll be responding to your questions in the chat space in the live Q&A. I'll also have additional resources for conversation and contemplation at this link, which you can access with that web address or the QR code. Let's get started. So I said I've been a mathematics teacher for 30 years, and I've seen the introduction of different mathematics standards across those years in 1989 and 2000, and the Common Core standards in particular in 2008. Across that time, we as a math education community have been trying to look at what goes on in math classrooms. And I, as a teacher myself, have been trying to pay a lot of attention to what goes on in my own classroom and also visit other classrooms to see what's going on there. What I've become interested in over these years is connecting math to the needs of my students and the changing needs of society at large. And I think we as a math education community would like students to use math in their lives and to see it as something that they can enjoy also just for its own sake. We want students to have access to STEM fields and to use math in their workplace, even if it's not one of the quote-unquote traditional STEM fields. For the entire history of this country, we've wanted an informed electorate, and that has increasingly meant new kinds of mathematics in schools and more mathematics. And we're certainly in an era right now where calls for more mathematics instruction are seemingly more and ever urgent. In particular, we want to respond to current events in our world, and at the same time, we also want to respond to students' interests and their own individual questions. So recently, the NCTM looked at the purposes of mathematics, and I'll give you a moment here to look at this slide. As you can see, it cuts across from early childhood and elementary all the way through high school about the purposes of learning mathematics. I present this as an introduction to this talk about mathematical practices. Mathematical practices are the things that the students do in schools and that teachers do. And I'll be looking at both of those aspects, both teacher practices and student practices in the math classroom during my presentation today. So the title of my presentation, Practices Make Progress, is a little play on words with practice makes perfect. And as you'll see throughout the presentation, this is a live presentation I'm making right now for your later recording. And I'll bring up the topic of mistakes throughout the presentation today. We do think, as I just said, that practice makes perfect. But what I'll present to you today is a little bit of a history of mathematical teaching and learning practices taken from different sources, and some of my reflections on them. These are drawn from the 70s and 80s through to the present, and how I think they are relevant to the present moment. So here are practice standards from the Common Core standards. This is something you may be familiar with if you're a teacher or math educator. And again, I'd like you to take a pause for a moment and read those, even if you're familiar with them. And hopefully you have some paper or something to jot down notes nearby. Take a look at it one more time. And do you see something missing for you personally if you were a math teacher or a math student? So take a moment to think about that. And as I would do in a live presentation, wait time and giving attendees, students, teachers, whoever I'm working with, time to think about what's on screen or what's being presented to them, I think is one of the most important mathematical practices. I'll point that out right here. A few years back, I looked at this list, and one of the things I noticed was that enjoyment wasn't listed here, nor were, as I said a moment ago, mistakes. The word mistake is not in the Common Core state standards, and you might see that it's somewhere in here. Making sense of problems and persevering and solving them might involve making mistakes along the way. But as I looked at this list, recently as I prepared for this presentation and a couple years ago, and thinking about the present moment, we must remember that students are people who have a variety of needs and interests. This list isn't all of who they might want to be and doesn't completely describe what it means to do mathematics. Now, of course, no one list can do all of that. And I attempted in an NCTM article a couple of years ago to make my own list with a different lens. Take again a moment to read these 8 possible math practices. And before I move on, I'll mention that wait time can seem excruciating. And when we work with students, and giving students time to think is one of the most important math practices that one could possibly imagine, I think. Now, this list, I was thinking about broader purposes of math as NCTM has presented, as I showed you in the previous slide. There's more to math than expertise, processes, proficiencies, fluency, those things. We know the importance of those, but I imagined this list of 8 practices focused on how students might act as they grow up in communities of other people. Again, as you watch this presentation, take a moment to jot down some thoughts for the later Q&A. And my thought here was, I was thinking about, who do students want to be when they're in our math classrooms? I think that should be part of math practices as well. We can support students to be themselves and to see new possible identities for themselves, and not just mold them into some ideal math student. So as we think about our mathematical practices, we need to think about students and their identities, and in particular, allow them to make mistakes and have time to make those mistakes. Now, students' identities come from inside, but they're also connected with the larger world. There are contexts in which they live. Throughout mathematics instruction, authentic connections to real-world experiences should include students' interests, their individual interests, their cultures, and the communities that they are a part of. We can imagine a math classroom that looks just like the interesting world that's outside the classroom walls, and just as interesting as the students we teach. Math class can be a place where you ask questions and debate things and take positions, just like in any other class, or just like you would do if you were out in the street or on your front porch arguing over anything about who's got the best chances in the playoffs or whether something's fair or not. I said earlier that I'm affiliated with a number of different institutions that look to promote good math instruction and good math practices. I note that math classrooms don't have math labs where there are lots of objects to pick up in front of them, where you can easily get hands-on, and I wonder about that. I think about English class, where you talk about truth and meaning and feelings, and in math, students can find themselves studying things that are disconnected from their interests, cultures, and communities. So as we look at our math practices in our classroom at this particular moment in time, it's on us to look at our students, who they are, what their identities are now, what identities they might be looking to grow into, and have the mathematics that we study recognize that our students are human beings. I wrote down over here that on my notes for the presentation, students are people too. And sometimes we think of them as just the sum of their test scores. And certainly you're here at this conference and we're talking about the test scores and we're talking about education and statistics and things like that. But as I'll argue throughout the presentation today, what we've got here is the humans in front of us. That's what we should be looking at first. So the questions that are on the screen right now are all questions that have a place in the math classroom. I've seen the stereotype about math that certain things should not be talked about in math class because you need to stick to the math or stick to the numbers. But that kind of approach doesn't lead to long-term retention. What you will remember from math class is what you were interested in, what you were passionate about, how you were treated, the things that you experienced in more than one way, as well as what you practice in the conventional, repetitive way that students need to retain mathematics. So the real math is right there in front of us across the K-12 curriculum. We can help students develop deep understandings that enable them to ask more questions, and I think most importantly, motivate students to seek out more mathematics. The worst outcome that you can have is when students get their test score and say, that's the end for me in math. I don't want to take any more. So as we continue to look at the present moment and what we can do for our students, it's important to think about them and who they are and their identities and what they're bringing to the math classroom. It's important to think about the test score and the test and quiz tomorrow and to have them practice the skills that they need. But it's also important to keep a view towards the future as well, and that what students are doing today does not necessarily determine what they will do in the future. But our practices in the math classroom should focus on all three of those things: the past, the present, and the future. Now, mathematics can proceed from these items on the screen. I'm not going to offer examples right here during the pre-recorded session, but we can talk about that later and in the Google Doc asynchronously as well. Now, what I'm going to show next is the mathematics teaching practices, which were published in Catalyzing Change in NCTM, and also published in Principles to Actions, came from Principles to Actions first. And as I did before, I'd like you to pause for a moment. And there's two screens here. There's one and then this other one. So take a moment on this screen. And again, think for a moment with your paper or pencil or pen, and what's present here and what's absent. So I'll give you a moment to look at the screen. And what I'll note before moving to the second screen of mathematics teaching practices from NCTM is that these are based on what we know, not just about how to teach, but how students learn and how students think. And at the basis of all these practices is that students are doing something, not just teachers, that the student-teacher relationship is one of a constant back and forth and looking at what each of them are actually doing in the classroom in that moment. We know that when students learn, learning occurs differently in different contexts, whether you're outside doing an experiment or in the classroom working on a problem on pencil and paper, or whether it's something that's drawn from real life or something that's drawn from a computer simulation. We know that children are not passive recipients of knowledge, and this is what's behind all these teaching practices that NCTM promotes. Students are always taking what's going on, and I'll say about some metaphors later, but it's different for each student. You're giving the same lesson, but what students are interpreting from that lesson depends upon their identity. It depends on their backgrounds, and it depends on their context and the life experiences that they're bringing to you. If you're at this conference, you probably know that teaching is far more complex than the general public thinks, and it's often more complex than we teachers think ourselves. So 4 more math teaching practices. And again, thinking about what's present and what's missing there, this is something I come back to a lot as I'm thinking about my own teaching. And again, I think the bedrock of these, there's different debates about how often to use this and how much productive struggle and when to use the purposeful questions. The last item there, elicit and use evidence of student thinking, again, I think is the bedrock of all of our teaching practices. And when we think also about what students are doing in the classroom, giving them the opportunity to make mistakes, to have time to think. We're not going to have student thinking if students don't have time to think. My 30 years of experience as a math educator tells me that students are both novices at things, that things are always brand new, but they're also experts in ways that we often don't notice because perhaps we're too focused on moving on to the next topic or following the pacing guide. Again, we're talking at this conference perhaps about learning loss and falling behind. I think that Our teaching practices have to recognize that students, as I said before, are human, and we can't just speed the video up to 1.5 times and have the same result. So that idea of pausing and waiting and thinking about what teachers are doing and thinking about what students are doing and how they're interacting. As I look back in 30 or 40 years of math education, these ideas are not new. In my research for this presentation, I looked at another set of practices this is from 1999. And again, I'll pause to let you take a look at this and see if you see any similarities between this. It was from another source, which I'll put in the chat right now live. But I particularly saw questions are planned to engage students in sustained discourse structured around powerful ideas. This list didn't come from the NCTM, and it's much older than that. And yet it's a practice that thinks about both what the teacher is doing and that the student discourse is the key part of that. We know that when students learn, they need to develop networks of connected knowledge structured around those powerful ideas. And they need to see that math in forms that make the math accessible for practice, like the traditional conventional practice, and also for application. Disconnected bits of information are less likely to be learned well. You may end up only with low-level processes such as memorization. And memorization is important, but we need to go beyond that so that the ideas are retained in ways that are accessible in the future. We know that textbook publishers and school districts and the nation sometimes become so focused on content coverage that they lose sight of the larger purposes and goals that guide teaching and learning. Keeping goals in mind, thinking about meaningful learning, what that means to the student at this moment, while also explaining clearly, giving those cues to help with memory. Again, time, sufficient opportunities to practice and apply what they are learning. Time to work in pairs. That's perhaps not efficient, as they say, but I'll leave this slide with saying that that top one, students learn best within cohesive and caring learning communities. If you have any mathematical practice, it's about knowing your students well and connecting to them. I think I have one more comment on this slide before moving on, connecting to what I've said earlier in the presentation. Students learn from the practices that go around them. If their main activity in class is listening, it's potentially more difficult for them to realize that mathematics takes action and questioning. So when we treat, I want to go back to that again, mistakes as natural parts of the learning process and encourage students to work collaboratively and help one another, when students can ask questions without the fear of being embarrassed by their peers or their teachers, they can share their ideas, teachers can learn from them. And it's sometimes when students are struggling with something, it's hard to see how expert they will be or all the knowledge that they are bringing to the situation. So the teaching strategies and the teaching practices described here give students that chance. Now, over my years in education, I've had the opportunity as a math teacher and as a math supervisor and as a graduate student and a researcher to work with students from pre-K through 12 and into college. And recently I was thinking again about kindergarten students. I was reading a book called Playful Mathematics. And again, you're at this conference and time for play might seem to be the least important thing at this particular moment in time. But when we give students opportunity to play with mathematics, and that's one of our practices, we as teachers can become aware of the mathematical potential in our students. We can find what math is in a particular situation. We can bring in those tasks, tools. We can go indoors and out. We get to listen and observe our students with care. We can assess which, I'm just saying the same practices that were on the other slides, but really thinking about, I don't know, just take a look at those kids and, just what do you notice and what do you wonder about what they're doing right now and how important that mathematical practice of play and noticing and wondering is to student learning. Students need freedom, whether they be this age or in 12th grade, as we'll look at in a moment, to develop their own ideas, to explore others' ideas, to make predictions, to reason, to explain. We can't miss these opportunities in mathematics. We have a tendency to overcorrect and try to say, okay, no, this is the right way of doing it. To focus just on the series of small predetermined steps. We sometimes try to avoid the making of mistakes. I just smile when I look at kids doing this, and I think, can students in my 12th grade class still be smiling like that? And that's the mathematical practice that I think we really need to promote. When we give students opportunities for just sheer joy and, wow, this isn't something that's going to be graded or quizzed, and mix that in with moments of direct teaching, I think that's the route forward. So moving from students in pre-K and K to students in 12th grade, I said earlier that I've worked with NCTM and the Mathematical Association of America. We're all looking at our mathematical practices. On the next slide, I'm going to show you a list of mathematical practices from college classrooms in calculus. Again, I'll pause for you to take a look at those and jot down some notes. Think about the connections, the comparisons, what's missing, what's present from the previous slides that I've shown you. So here goes. So while you're reading that, speaking of mistakes, I forgot to mention, and this is pre-recorded, so you probably figured this out in advance, but you can be putting your questions into the chat as well, not just writing it down on paper. And I encourage you throughout the rest of the presentation, if you haven't done already, to put ideas and thoughts in the chat for us all to read. In particular, looking at this just talking about the 10 things about good teaching could be its own presentation. So let me mention a little bit about these two lists. This was a study of calculus classrooms conducted by the Mathematical Association of America with funding from the NSF. And the characteristics most strongly correlated with maintaining student confidence, enjoyment in math, and a desire to continue in mathematics were found to be those 10 items on the left side of the screen. The researchers called it simply good teaching. The list on the other side, ambitious teaching. These are other practices that students reported. And I will note that all of these characteristics reflect a rapport between student and instructor, something that only develops when there's trust and understanding that we're all human and have different identities. The list on the right, the what one might call ambitious teaching or active learning approaches, also cause gains in student achievement, confidence, enjoyment, and interest in mathematics, but only if the instructor was also rated high on the list on the left. So without that good student-teacher rapport, ambitious teaching strategies could end up being counterproductive. So again, take another moment to put things in the chat or to write some stuff down for our later live Q&A. And again, think about the comparisons between the lists I've chosen to show you so far. There are many more lists of teaching practices and practices that what students should be doing in the math classroom. But I'm finding as I look over the last 30 years, there is a bit of a convergence on some of the themes that I've talked about here today thus far. ones that give students time, allow students to make mistakes, that include enjoyment, that recognize students' identity, that build around concepts, all things that are not easily prescribed in a step-by-step process. Certainly, number 7 here, my calculus instructor made class interesting, isn't something that I can give you a step-by-step guide for how to do. It involves the real people in front of you. Now, before we get to some conclusions, the conclusions that I have for you in the pre-recorded session, we're not going to do math in the pre-recorded session, but I'm going to give you something to take a look at to try to tie together some of the practices that I've spoken about thus far. Here, what you see is that I've lined up some students on a soccer or football field. That's the Women's World Cup going on right now. And they're all going, well, they already have actually flipped a coin. Their coin either came up heads or tails. And if they have a flip of heads, they will take a step forward. And if they flipped tails, they will take a step back. Now, you're not going to actually experience this. When students do this, there's a lot of joy and giggling and noticing and wondering and asking questions and generating ideas, all things that I've talked about in the previous lists of math practices. And before I show you the next slide, just imagine what's going to happen. They all flipped a coin, a fair coin, and then the first step will happen. Then they're going to flip a coin again. After they flip a coin a second time, they'll again do the same thing. A step forward if they flip heads and a step backwards if they flip tails. What's going to happen now? It appears some of the students have gone back to where they started. Some have flipped heads, tails. Some have flipped tails, heads. Some have flipped tails, tails. And some have flipped heads, heads. Oh, why not continue? Flip a third time, or a fourth time, and a fifth time, and a sixth time. Now, they're all over the place, but at this point, I ask them to turn towards the goal there that you can see at the bottom of the screen and to walk forward. And this is what you get. Only a few students have flipped 5 heads and 1 tail, for instance. Some students have flipped 3 heads and 3 tails. And after the students physically move to get to this position, they are buzzing as they walk back to the classroom, asking lots more questions. And some of them will remember that years ago in their curriculum, they had made little towers with 2 colors and made different patterns. And as I said in the title, long-term memory involves both practicing the conventional practice. I want to know my math facts and have a way to access them. But we're also accessing students' memories and building on the knowledge that they've built up over the years. And when students feel their questions are valued and that they're seen as people who are not just to learn the thing that's in front of them today. Again, as a teacher for 30 years, I can report that wonderful things happen for students, for every student. So again, not time right now to dig into this. We can talk, and I'll have links for this in the Google Doc for you to explore this particular math concept further. But I'll mention that, as we said at the beginning, purposes of mathematics involve looking at the real world, looking at ourselves. Been some storms recently where I am, and some changes in weather, and perhaps changes in climate. the math that students are learning by walking out on the soccer field with coin flips, with looking at little reds and blues blocks that they put together, is the same mathematics that can be used to investigate how often flooding will currently occur and might occur in the future, and allow them to ask questions about insurance and money and other current events in the world. So I leave this section by saying that math class, what should be our main practice? In math class, it should be someplace where you get to bring all of your questions, all of yourself, all your ideas, and not just the ones that you would consider typically to be quote unquote mathematical. As I come to a close here, I'm going to show you another slide. And again, I'll ask you to think about what you notice and what you wonder about it. And then I'll sum up. So here goes. Take a moment to pause for you to look around the room. You can pose questions in the chat right now, of course. What do you notice in this photo, and what do you wonder? It's hard to predict the future, so I don't know what you're typing in there right now, and I'll be looking at it live as I'm watching this. But when I want to tell you a little story about this slide and say that when I first saw it, I said, oh, this looks like kids in math class and they're all doing the same thing. And but I paused and I stopped and I gave myself more time to think about it. And I started to think that all these students have identities. Now, this is there's the link to the photo there. I believe this is a photo from a German classroom, or a French or German or maybe Dutch classroom in the late 1800s. And I thought, well, there's lots of possibilities here. These devices they have in front of them, perhaps an abacus, give them an opportunity. When I first looked at this, I said, oh, maybe this is just, teacher-centered instruction, which is not giving students a chance to think. Are these students passive? I don't know from this one snapshot. So as we look at the snapshot that many of us were perhaps talking about in the other presentations, the statistics that's come in from the NAEP, I think that these one snapshots don't tell us everything that we need to know. We need to continue to focus on the students, their context, what they've experienced right now, their identities, and that things that we might see are obstacles are potentially opportunities. In my last slide here, I'll say that, I think there's always the hope in education that, we'll be able to get every student to grow at the same rate if we just have the right fertilizer or the right field and the right amount of sunlight and, all those things. But, our students are humans. They're not plants that we're growing. And it's not so simple. So I want to thank you for being here today to listen to my conversation, and I look forward to chatting with you right now and in the future as well through the Google Doc. Your students are brilliant. Remember that first. Give them opportunities to practice in all sorts of ways, to think, to reason, to memorize. All those things are going to lead your students forward. Thank you. So online intelligence tutoring systems, I think if those kinds of tools can be used to encourage the traditional kind of practice of, let me repeat this procedure again, and then return to a little bit later and see if it's still there and change the conditions a little to keep, as we spoke about earlier in the chat, stretching the students. I think those online intelligence tutoring systems can be useful. Leaving students in front of those for the system to do that teaching, I think, doesn't align well with a lot of the practices that I shared in the presentation. And yes, I've confirmed that you can comment in the Google Doc. So if you're watching this at any particular time, not just when it was live, I encourage you to leave your thoughts about these reflections that I have as a teacher of mathematics for 32 years, looking at the different practices and guides that have come out about how students learn mathematics over the years. And these are my reflections. I think I'm interested in yours, as well as the links to all the wide variety of research out there about mathematics education and learning. When we think about the social interaction, about the math itself, and about cognitive science, and about the role of emotion and context, all of those things come to play with deciding on the mathematical practices that your students will be practicing in your classroom. And as I said, I know that the route forward, sometimes all the news says only test scores drop precipitously, but I'll repeat what I said in the presentation, that it's not feasible to turn on instruction at 1.5 pace. Perhaps we can find better ways of linking with students' knowledge, and that might be not a way to accelerate learning, but to keep that progress going.